Started. Welcome, everybody. My name is Eric Rogers. I'm the Executive Director at BikeWalkKC. We're really glad to have you all here tonight. As Amy said, we do have everybody muted to start out with, but we do welcome you to introduce yourselves in the chat. Let us know who you are, where you're from, and at any point along the way, if you have questions, also please add those into the chat and we'll make sure to get to as many of those as we can at the end of the program. So tonight we're going to be talking about data and the stories that we can see in data and that we can use data to tell the stories. We at BikeWalkKC really believe in the power of data. It informs a lot of the work that we do and what we advocate for and the programs and things that we offer. Both the quantitative data, the hard numbers, as well as the qualitative data, the lived experiences of people in our community. And so tonight we're going to talk with a really awesome data expert who is a resident of Kansas City. His name is Jim Hubbel. He's a solution engineering manager with a company called Streetlight Data, which is doing a lot of really cool stuff to use big data to inform decisions about mobility and transportation. And so what we're going to do tonight is look at some of the data that we've found and that Jim and his colleagues have found during the bike boom, the so-called bike boom that happened last year during the pandemic, and see how that impacted not just biking, but also walking and transportation and mobility. So I'm going to turn it over to Jim, and we're just going to dive right in. I'll let Jim share his presentation and then introduce himself and Streetlight and get going. So Jim, please take it away.
Great. Well, good evening, everyone. And just a quick check, is my screen share working? Can you see my bike boom title slide? All right. Yeah, well, let's go ahead and jump right in, because while I'm sure you're all, just starving in your lives these days for another PowerPoint and another, Zoom call, I think probably your main reason for attending is not to see, my presentation, but to get into the discussion. So my hope with this is just to kind of, seed the conversation and, but, get through this pretty quickly and get into the fun part. So thanks again to Eric and the BikeWalkKC team for having me. As you mentioned, I'm Jim Hubbel. I'll just keep it brief. I'm currently a solution engineering manager with Streetlight Data. But prior to that, many of you may know me from my previous career at the Mid-America Regional Council. So I come from a transportation planning background, and I worked at MARC for about almost 20 years before moving over to Streetlight Data about 2.5 years ago. And besides my, I guess, sort of more professional or educational background, I'll also just mention that I'd like to think in some very small way, I was also part of Kansas City's bike boom, because I was one of the many people who, picked up a new bicycle during the pandemic, and I've been really enjoying the fruits of the labor of transportation planners and advocates like BikeWalkKC and building better bike and walking infrastructure around the KC Metro. So today I am just going to give a very short presentation, and it's going to be, divided up into kind of really just 3 sections. The first 2 are going to be very fast. First, I'm just going to, just say a little bit, kind of set the stage about, data and the evolution of data. And then I will spend just a few slides talking about Streetlight Data specifically and what we do. And then the bulk of this will be spent talking about some trends that we were able to kind of uncover through some analysis of the bicycling and walking metrics that are available from Streetlight Data, specifically focused on the Kansas City region. So this introductory section is just intended to kind of set the stage for today's discussion. And I'll start by introducing some high-level themes over the course of the next few slides. So in fair warning, I'll briefly step up onto my metaphorical soapbox as I weave in some of my own personal opinions and philosophy along the way. So, I just like to start by saying, good data is paramount in order to plan for the future. It always has been. But with so much uncertainty about what the future holds, I'd argue it's more important today than ever. And interestingly, so this graphic I put up, it was funny because I created this for a course on sort of big data that I was giving to a class on travel demand modeling at a university in Denver. And when and this was given in fall of 2019. And recently I gave that same kind of a refreshed version of it to that class. And when I pulled up the slide, I was like, interesting. I did add the recovery piece, but I'm like, really the same sort of disruptive forces, that were relevant, even though fall of 2019 seems like forever ago, they're still pretty much relevant, today, even kind of post pandemic or as we recover. But so like the scooters and the bike shares and kind of and ride sharing, disruptive tech, while it may have sort of hit the pause button briefly during the pandemic, it's already on its way back, and it'll probably be more significant going forward. And that's kind of vexing for a lot of transportation planners. Shrinking budgets, still an issue. The sort of dwindling capacity of the gas tax to be our only funding source for transportation, still a reality. I'd like to think that still within the transportation world, there's kind of this shift away from just building more and more roads and focusing more on kind of operating those facilities more efficiently. The focus on people, it was there before, instead of just moving vehicles or like looking at traffic volumes, it was more about just how do we create mobility for human beings and focus on moving people rather than metal boxes. I'd say that focus on people is even more pronounced sort of post-pandemic, with a very enhanced focus on social equity. And then, of course, as we recover both sort of medically from a pandemic, but also economically, these are going to all be sort of forces that guide but also challenge our decisions going into the future. So while the majority of this presentation will involve discussion of metrics derived from big data, it's important to quickly establish some general definitions for both what I'll just call kind of traditional data and then big or passive data. Nothing in this section here is intended to argue that one is necessarily better than the other, just that they're different. So let's start by just kind of quickly defining them, or at least what I'll use as kind of guiding definitions as I talk. So for the purposes of this presentation and discussion, the definition or types of traditional data will encompass the sources shown on this slide. And I'm not going to go through this entire list. But what I will say is, traditional data, at least for the purposes of this discussion, I'm saying it's something that's manually collected with either surveys or some other sort of in-field sensor, and it's usually collected with the specific and typically the sole purpose of measuring transportation. It's not really collected for any other reason. That's sort of that was always the traditional approach to collecting data. So you can think of it as tubes laid across the road to measure cars or bikes, or infrared to measure pedestrians. But it's usually something that involves like equipment installed in the field. And it comes with all kinds of pros and cons. Some of these are definitely arguable and they could probably apply to both. But generally, these are just sort of points I've compiled over my however many years of experience in working with all kinds of different transportation data. Moving on to big data or passive data, which I'll use interchangeably for the purposes of this presentation. These can come from really a variety of different sources. Here's some listed here on the slide, but I'd say that ecosystem of where big and passive data comes through is constantly growing and expanding. And some of the more common sources, though, include, at least that are used for transportation analytics, include GPS, like things coming from in-vehicle navigation systems, LBS or location-based services. That's kind of the same thing, but it comes from apps on smartphones. There's also cellular tower data, just generally Internet of Things, pass readers, so like transit passes or even like easy passes on a toll road, and connected and autonomous vehicle data, which is one that is emerging and rapidly growing. And often, I'd say a key differentiator is that big data is very often, maybe even more often than not, being collected for a purpose other than transportation. So it's almost like it's, there's a sort of an indirect value of this data to transportation. And I will actually talk about just a little bit of the pros and cons here, just because now that I work for a provider of big data analytics, these are things that I hear regularly, probably on a daily basis. I mean, there's lots of pros. These data sets are massive. They're being collected all the time, so it's easy to look at change over time with them. They are fairly objective. It's just the data's there. It can be interpreted in different ways, but it doesn't really lie. And it's opening up a huge range of new use cases, many of which were never possible with traditional data, or they were at least prohibitively expensive. But with big data, there's a lot of skepticism around it. I mean, even just the mechanics of working with it is challenging. It's by its own name, it's big. There's a lot of processing and cleanup. There's a lot of sort of messiness to it, and even pieces of it that are essentially useless. But it's that third bullet under cons that is really kind of the tricky one, because it's so big and because there's so much processing involved. There's eventually there's some sort of algorithm, things like AI and machine learning that has to be used with it, and that's and understandably, it's sort of mysterious to a lot of practitioners, especially those that are used to working with more traditional sources. And so there's just a lot of skepticism around it. Also, and I won't even go into this today, but there's the whole issue of bias that can sometimes be built into these algorithms. Maybe that would be another topic for a different discussion. And so in general, there is a lot of industry skepticism around it, although I find that that's waning. So really kind of the point I'm trying to make is, it's not really it's not big data versus traditional data. We need all the data. They actually work incredibly well together. And I would even say in many cases, like big data and its abilities, the ability of machine learning algorithms to take big data and turn it into very valuable and meaningful metrics depends on good traditional data in many ways. At least it does currently. So I will now step down off my soapbox and just spend a couple minutes talking about Streetlight Data. So Streetlight Data, where I work currently, and I have been for the last couple of years, is essentially it's a big data analytics provider. A more even sort of simpler, basic way of describing the company is it's a software company, but it's kind of a special niche software company that brings together people with a lot of talent in data science and application development, people from the transportation planning and engineering industry, and then people that have a lot of experience just sort of in the startup world. And by bringing these different skill sets together, we've and our founder Laura Schul has created Streetlight Data. And the idea, really, the goal of the company was to leverage these data sources that are kind of being generated and collected already to provide deeper insights into how people move and in transportation in general. So just very quickly. So this is there's a lot going on in this slide. The main point I'd want to get across is the way Streetlight Data, the types of big data that Streetlight Data works with, and how we work with it. Basically, we take two different sources. We take the GPS data that comes from again commercial truck fleets with in-vehicle navigation systems. And then we also take a much larger data set, which we call LBS, or location-based services. That comes from apps installed on smartphones. And there are a lot of smartphones out there, and there are a lot of apps in the universe that share this sort of, they basically collect location data. You can think of it when you install a new app on your smartphone, and when you launch it for the first time, it asks if it can access the phone's location. That's LBS. And so in the background, these apps especially are leaving lots of little breadcrumbs behind. Those are the purple dots on the animation that's looping in the background. And basically what Streetlight Data does, though, is we take all this ping data and we try to turn it into something more meaningful. We essentially process it into trips, and then those trips are contextualized. So we use things like road network data, like land use data, population and employment data, and we basically add and kind of enrich the attributes of the trips themselves, but also use it for a lot of kind of normalization and expansion. And this is I won't go through all this in detail. This is often what we share with customers and prospects the first time we're introducing them. But the main point I really want to get across, there's actually two key points I'd like to get across. One is like the spatial precision of the data, because it's going to be important in the later discussion. But I'll use my, I think that shows up. So the spatial precision of most LBS and GPS data falls between 5 meters and 20 meters. The average is about 15 to 18. And so that's important because there are other types of data that are less kind of spatially precise. And while they might be good for certain applications, the Streetlight data shows LBS and GPS because of its spatial precision and its ability to then actually accurately identify the path or the transportation facility that the device is taking. Then the second key point I just wanted to make is that while this data is very detailed and granular, it's very highly privacy protected. I mean, it's privacy protected before Streetlight data even obtains it. It's just it's latitude longitude points with a hashed device ID and a timestamp. And again, we do take and contextualize a lot of that information, sort of reintroduce or infer attributes that go with it. But it's at least Streetlight Data is a company. It's all about protecting privacy. There's no way to re-identify individuals within the data sets. But basically, kind of sum up, we take all that data, we process it into trips. We actually have mode classifier algorithms. So as you can see in that sort of center graphic, we're actually processing trips for cars, trucks, bus trips, passenger rail trips, and bicycles and pedestrians, and that's what we'll focus on a lot today. I included one more slide on it's pretty high level, but just to kind of talk a little bit more about the process we use to classify the modes, specifically bicycle and pedestrian. So again, we're starting with every month we obtain billions of pings from smartphones and GPS devices. And so basically what we did, with any sort of machine learning algorithm, you basically take data where something is unknown, in this case it's the mode, and then you train it on similar data where in this case the mode, bicycle and pedestrian, is known. And so we use just sort of traditional machine learning techniques, but we took data. Some of the data might have come from household travel surveys. Some of it might have come from actually kind of an army of volunteers that we recruited to help fine tune our algorithms. And in many cases, it's coming from other like publicly available data sources like permanent bike and pedestrian counters that we use for validation and calibration. But not to give I'll just give a quick kind of crash course in machine learning. But it's basically, again, you just sort of you train it on known data, then you turn that algorithm loose on unknown data, then you validate, see how well it did, and you just keep iterating until it gets to an acceptable level of accuracy. So I don't expect everybody to be able to see the details of all those charts, but basically on any of those charts, it's sort of a relationship between permanent counter data for bikes and pedestrians at different locations in different parts, different cities in US and Canada. And the orange line is the permanent counter, and the blue line is our sample. And so this is be an uncalibrated sample, so it doesn't necessarily mean that the two need to match up, but they should be following the same shape of a curve, and they all do. And so for any of you statistics nerds out there, basically our R squared, which is like a correlation coefficient, goodness of fit measure for different bike and pedestrian counter locations. It ranges from 0.71, which is pretty good, to 0.9, which is really good. So let's get into the data. All right, I'm going to sort of tell the story from the what sort of led me to do some deeper dive analysis on Kansas City, and of course it all started with during the pandemic. I'm sure you've all seen multiple versions of these different charts, but basically the media especially was very concerned and interested in like what was happening with traffic, and especially state DOTs and transportation agencies were also very interested. And no matter which way you slice or dice the data or index it, or what part of the country you look at, this is what you always saw, was this huge drop. The chart on the left is actually showing data going all the way back to 1996. So you just see this precipitous drop in 2020 during the pandemic. That's national data. The chart on the right is what was happening in the Kansas City metro, daily VMT information. And you can see again, right around late March, the daily vehicle miles traveled plummets, and then it kind of starts recovering throughout April, May, and June. And by July, and eventually then even August and beyond, it was back to almost pre-pandemic levels. And that's all fine, but at the same time, I'm seeing all these headlines, and these are different screenshots for things that were happening around Kansas City, but this was actually happening everywhere. You're seeing all these great articles about taking advantage of the reduction in traffic and implementing like open streets or slow streets in cities all around the country, kind of giving space back to bikes and pedestrians while the traffic levels were down. And then similar headlines like the bike shops couldn't even keep up with demand. So many people were going out and buying bikes. And so I was really interested. What really then kind of pushed me over the edge was one of my colleagues at Streetlight Data did this national analysis where for every, or for all the, I think the maybe top 100 metropolitan statistical areas in the nation by population, did a bike activity comparison where it compared May activity in May 2020 to May 2019. And lo and behold, almost everywhere in the nation had some different different percentage increase of bicycle. In this case, they were looking at bicycle miles traveled. And that was really exciting. And I was especially happy to see that Kansas City was one of those that I think is probably in that second category where it increased more than 50%. I was like, all right, I got to look into this a little bit more. And since I've got this great data at my fingertips, I have the luxury of doing so. So I set out to answer a pretty simple question. Was there really a bike or pedestrian boom in Kansas City during the coronavirus pandemic? So I mentioned that I used to work at Mark, and so whenever I kind of want to do an analysis in Kansas City, I can't help, I default to looking at the entire metropolitan area. This is the 9-county Mark planning area. It's just something that's when you do something for 20 years, it's kind of ingrained in your behavior. So I'll just explain kind of high level what I did. So my first thing I set out to do is like, all right, I'm going to have to establish a baseline. So let's look at 2019, the last full year worth of data that was, we'll say, kind of normal conditions for 2020. But then let's also, analyze 2020 data, and just do kind of a year over year, comparison to 2019 for relative year over year changes. But also knowing that for bikes and pedestrians and their kind of seasonal patterns, since we do have seasons in Kansas City, there are going to be changes kind of month to month. So let's look at it in two different ways. We'll look year over year, but then we'll also look at kind of indexing it to January to control, if you will, for seasonal changes. And my sort of practical approach for how I did this in the Insight platform, without getting into too much crazy detail, I basically did what we call an activity analysis. Just looks at all activity happening. It can be done at a bike trail level, something that granular, or it can be done at an area level. So I just used the shapes for all 9 counties in the metropolitan planning area, and basically said, select any bicycle, and did the same thing for pedestrian, but any trip that starts or ends within the county. And then I defined activity as, we'll just say, look at the trip starts, since while it's definitely possible along certain counties that share a state line, there are probably some trips that start in one county and end in another county. But when something's being done at this core civil level, I figured just looking at trip starts would be a good way to get kind of total activity within a county. And then I analyzed every month individually, all 12 in 2019 and the other 12 months in 2020, to get some kind of monthly trend data. So, and these are pretty simple charts, but I feel like there's a lot packed into them. So, started off with my baseline, and right off the bat, you can see, and this we'll start with bicycle activity. So again, this is just sort of relative levels of activity within each county. And I went ahead and separated it out. Each color band represents a different county, so you can kind of see, not surprisingly, Jackson and Johnson, the two most populous counties within the metro, are contributing the most to the bicycle activity within the region. Clay County being pretty close third. And then of course you can see what wouldn't surprise any of us that know the weather patterns in this region. You see kind of a steady climb as you move out of winter, and kind of hits a plateau around maybe June or so, and then starting in maybe October, as the weather starts to cool off, you see activity levels start to decline. There never goes to zero, but they're definitely the warmer months have more activity than the cooler months. So then I ran the exact same thing for 2020, and boom, there it is. And those should be on the same scale. I'll bring the two together here on the next slide. But you see generally the same pattern in the curve, although there's this interesting dip in July. And maybe during the discussion, I'd be curious to hear theories on this. And I don't have an answer. I did go in and just to verify that it wasn't some sort of weird blip in the data, making sure that wasn't happening everywhere in the United States. It definitely wasn't. But still you see that kind of general curve where there's more activity in warmer months. But definitely just by comparing the relative numbers, way more activity really in every month of 2020, interestingly. And so just to kind of bring the two together, I've converted these instead of bar charts, just converted them into curves. But there you have it. I mean, in no single month in 2020 was less than the corresponding month in 2019. You do, again, in 2020, see that kind of interesting dip. And there are definitely some months where the kind of year over year difference is a lot more significant than others. But I think by looking at this data, you can kind of conclusively say that there was indeed a bike boom in the Kansas City region. And it can look at these kind of individually county by county, but it's always the same general story that 2020 was greater than 2019. And as I mentioned, because you might think, well, maybe there's just some like kind of seasonal issues happening here. So what in this chart, it's basically the exact same data, but I've indexed it to the month of January. So just each month is a kind of percent increase relative to January. Of course, you'd still expect to see, kind of a nice round curve as you saw the shape of the curve in the month-to-month data. Some things were a little bit interesting though, like in April, for example, actually the kind of relative change relative to January was less in 2020 than it was in 2019. So and that's of course the month where Kansas City, most of the metro had its stay-at-home orders. So just overall travel was down across all modes, most likely. And then kind of similarly, looks like in July, same situation, like the kind of indexed percent change from January was less than it was in 2019. So I'd still love to come up with some theories on what was happening in July of 2020 that reduced travel so much. But then again, I guess there's just one other month where it does in September that it does sort of dip below the index value. All right, I'm gonna try and keep this to, just got a few more slides and we'll get into our discussion. All right, so let's go in, did the exact same thing for pedestrian activity. Now here, so this is the 2019 data, in different patterns, like different seasonal patterns. This doesn't really surprise me, considering the fact that we have pretty hot summers. Also though that, so you gotta remember that like, in big data, a pedestrian trip is a pedestrian trip, whether it's a person, walking from, from their office to somewhere to get some lunch during the day, or if it's just a person walking from their car in the parking lot of Oak Park Mall, into the mall. It's still as long as certain kind of distance thresholds and differences between the origin and destination location are met, it's still classified as a pedestrian trip. So my theory on this is that you're probably picking up some like festivals and events, but also like sporting, like you might be picking up people walking around at the Arrowhead Stadium. But yeah, and then also walking a little bit less in July and June because it's so hot outside. Same thing, although very different, kind of fluctuations in pedestrian activity in 2020. The real interesting thing, I think, is that spike in April, when again everybody was, staying home from, for the most part, from work, and definitely not going out, shopping or dining. But I think people were walking around their neighborhoods more because there was really nothing else to do. But yeah, then really sort of like volatile pedestrian activity May through August, say, and then it kind of gets back to the normal shape of the curve once you hit, say, like September through December for pedestrian trips. So again, just kind of comparing the 2 years together. So still overall more pedestrian activity. So I think you could say there was something of a pedestrian boom in 2020 in the Kansas City region, although it, like 2020's advantage over 2019 definitely dipped in July. And if we index those, this is where it gets really interesting, is that really the only month where pedestrian activity, if we're indexing it to kind of control for seasonal fluctuations, indexing it back to January, July is the is the month in 2020 that was actually kind of less relative growth than it was in 2019. But still, for the most part, no matter how you slice or dice the data, the pedestrian activity in 2020 was definitely higher than it was in 2019. But it's just really interesting to see the fluctuations. Of course, be great to drill down a little bit deeper into this. Because when I look at this, one of the things I always see is like pedestrian exposure, or insights that can be gained into pedestrian exposure and how to improve pedestrian safety. So that's all I had. I think this would be a good time now to move into our discussion portion. And I can leave this slide up, Eric, or I can just stop sharing my screen, however you Bike Walk folks would like to do it.
And Jim, Eric's gonna tag along off of your presentation.
Oh, okay.
Is that okay, Eric?
Yeah. So thank you, Jim. I just have a few additional slides with some of our own data that I think is going to reinforce a lot of what Jim presented to us. So I'm going to share another screen here real quick. So yeah, I just want to quickly share a few things that we've collected ourselves at BikeWalkKC. The first thing we did back in May of last year was a survey of our members and stakeholders, because we wanted to see how the stay-at-home orders and the lockdowns were impacting the community. And we will share a bunch of links tomorrow in email for everybody with things like the survey and the report that Jim mentioned from Streetlight in our follow-up. So be sure to look for that tomorrow. But what we found was of the people that we surveyed, a huge number were reporting that they were walking more and biking more, especially spending more time walking. We saw, and so this was around May of last year, kind of at the height of the lockdown. And even though we saw a lot of people that were out walking and biking more, we also saw that they were reporting that there were still the same barriers for them that had been in place before. So things like broken sidewalks, missing sidewalks, not feeling comfortable biking in the street and traffic. Those are all still important barriers to people. And we know from other surveys and data and studies that have been done that those barriers are even higher for Black and Brown individuals in our communities, who have the extra burden of over policing and harassment when they're out on the street. And folks in those communities report those continue to be barriers, especially last year, in light of all of the current events that were happening and the attention that was focused on the murder of George Floyd and all of the other things that were going on last year and continue to go on. So that's a little bit of our survey data we'll share with you tomorrow. Jim mentioned the Open Streets program, specifically in Kansas City, Missouri. That was a program to allow more places for people to walk and bike during the height of the lockdown. So we were able to work with some folks on city staff and some elected officials to create some new legislation to allow this to happen. And so the city took a few strategies around closing roads in the parks, like in Swope Park, so that people could take advantage of all that asphalt for other things besides driving. We saw, I think, a really cool group of seniors who were doing yoga in Swope Park out in the middle of the street once it was close to cars. The city converted a lot of the pedestrian signals downtown to create a walk signal automatically so folks wouldn't have to push the button. And then there was the neighborhood street closure permit that allowed folks to close the street in front of their homes so that there'd be a little bit more room, extend their front yards for socially distant gatherings and give kids more room to play. And we saw that the city issued about 77 permits last year. The interesting thing in this data was the vast majority were in the Brookside area, with a smattering in Midtown and on the east side. And there were a few in the Northland that aren't shown on this map. But that we were really fortunate that the city was willing to do that. It didn't go quite as far as we had hoped, but it was well used. And I think something to dig in further in the future would be why it was utilized so much more disproportionately in one part of the city than in other parts of the city. And for those that don't know, the city is continuing this permit again this year. So you can still close your street again this summer if you want to get a little bit more space in your own neighborhood to be outside. And then finally, I'll share a little bit from our community dashboard, which we launched last year and was the focus of one of these talks last September. And so if you want, you can go back and watch that and get more of the details about that and all the data that's there. But for this evening's topic, I just wanted to share a little bit of data on one thing is the amount of infrastructure. We've been tracking the amount of miles of bike lanes and trails and paths in the region. And we were really pleased to see that in the last couple of years, more than 70 miles of new trails and bike lanes have been built in the region. And more than half of that happened in 2020. So despite the pandemic, many municipalities in our region continued to invest in places to walk and bike. And the other thing we saw was with our bike share system. Some of you may know that the Ride KC bike share system is a partnership between BikeWalkKC and the KC Area Transportation Authority and local government agencies. This is a kind of a heat map of bike share usage during the time of day and the day of the week. And this is what happened in 2020. Before 2020, we had a pretty strong cluster of red during the morning and evening rush hour periods. So we inferred that we were getting a lot of commuting trips on bike share. And then during 2020, those morning trips completely disappeared and we saw a lot more activity in the afternoons, especially on the weekends, which we think is reflective of the folks that were using bikes to get exercise and get out of the house and get out into nature. And just overall, in terms of bike share, we did see a record year last year, and we're continuing to see strong usage throughout the pandemic. And then finally, I just wanted to share a little bit of additional data we were able to glean during the pandemic. As Jim pointed out, traffic was way down, but we also saw a lot of information from the KCPD, from the police department, saying that speeding was up, drag racing was up, crashes and injuries were actually increasing, even though people were driving a lot less. They were driving much more dangerously on those open, uncongested streets and highways. And so there was a little bit of a double-edged sword when things shut down. It really allowed for a lot of other activity to happen that wasn't as healthy or safe. And I think many of us probably saw the drag racing that was in the news many times during the course of last year, and saw some of those really disturbing videos of unsafe behavior. And then just finally, I wanted to share, a little bit of why the work that Jim and Streetlight does is so important, and that's because data is really hard to get, especially about walking and biking. There's just a low level of data. It's challenging for governments to make decisions about where to invest in facilities and infrastructure, or even as advocates for us sometimes to establish the need for making these improvements and these policies. And one example of that is the work we're doing on decriminalization. I'm trying to do things like get jaywalking out of the criminal code in Kansas City, or some of these other things like dirty bike tires that can be a reason for police to stop people, and which then lead to other interactions with the police that can ultimately result in violence. There's not a lot of data about that, and so we're finding it's really difficult to even establish the need to make some of these changes and policies. And then finally, I wanted to share something called Dangerous by Design, which is a report from Smart Growth America that looks especially at pedestrian safety and pedestrian crashes. It shows that in general, communities of color are at much higher risk of traffic crashes, especially pedestrians in communities of color. We'll share a link to that tomorrow in the follow-up email. But if you look at the map in Kansas City, it's really clear that, for example, the Independence Avenue corridor is a hotspot for pedestrian crashes and injuries and fatalities in the northeast part of Kansas City. And so what we're hoping to do with programs like this evening and working with groups like Streetlight and others is to get more data so we can show the extent of some of these problems, and then help policymakers and elected officials make better decisions about the types of public policies that they put in place and where they make investments in infrastructure and safety. And so thank you all for being here and participating in this. It's really important work. With that, I think we will open it up for questions now, and I'm gonna call on Amy Scrivener, from the BikeWalkKC team, who I think has been monitoring the questions and is gonna spend the next few minutes asking.
Yeah, we've had a few questions come in. Thank you to both of you. One question: what are some of the more reliable smartphone applications for tracking cycle and pedestrian data? Jim?
So I guess I'll kind of answer that in two ways. So the apps in the universe that Streetlight obtains, it's sort of raw data from its vendors. We actually don't know what those apps are, and that's by that it's by intent. We know that they are diverse in terms of their sort of market segmentation and applicability. But they aren't necessarily just those apps that are specifically intended to track like Map My Ride or Strava or things like that. So like what we've done is we've tried to build the algorithms that can just, based on kind of characteristics of the pings themselves and like the sequences of pings. So what's the speed? What's the acceleration? What's the urban context? Is this device moving along a trail or a road with a bike lane? Or it looks at all kinds of different factors, and it actually classifies the mode based on characteristics of the pings themselves. That said, I mean, there definitely are, like the two I mentioned, I know there are those and several others out there that they are intended for the explicit purpose of you know, I guess the users would have to opt in and be willing to share their data publicly for that purpose. And I'll even say, while we don't specifically use those, we have used information from those apps to validate our metrics. So we use it for sort of global things like, what's the average trip length of a bicycle trip in this market? You know, and is our other data matching up with that? So hopefully that answers the question.
Oh, thank you. Eric, this question is for you. Does the BikeWalkKC app for checking out bikes count these trips and location data? And they said from personal experience, they tried to end a ride outside of the boundaries today and they noted it.
Yes, the BikeWalkKC bike app does record the GPS of the trip. And so we can then take that aggregated data and map it. And there are some examples of heat maps on our dashboard of the bike share data. So we can see where people are riding, where there's demand for facilities. And so, for example, you know, local cities have used some of our bike share data to help inform where they do things like add bike lanes or expand trails. And so, yeah, just the act of using bike share, you are contributing to the data that eventually helps us all make biking better in Kansas City.
Another question, has the data from 2021 been evaluated through April? And does that show a continuation of the uptick in cycling pedestrian activity? In other words, are people's behaviors returning to 2019 levels now that things are returning to normal?
Ooh, well, I'll take it from my perspective. That's a great question. The data, so there is there's some lag time in when we get the data from our vendors and then we get it processed into the trips. So I just checked today, and our bicycle and pedestrian data is current through the end of March. But I haven't analyzed it yet. So maybe we'll have to do a follow-up here, and maybe even as we start getting into summer, and see if that trend continues. I certainly hope it is.
Another question, what do you think the city can do to better ensure that Kansas City's Black and brown residents, particularly residents living east of Troost, have access to BikeWalkKC bikes and have the ability to safely ride them on city streets? That is a very, a lot of questions going on in there.
Yeah, it's a lot of questions, and it gets to a big structural problem. So the city currently has a equity program in their shared use mobility program. So that includes BikeWalkKC bike. It also includes the scooter operators. There are some requirements to deploy a minimum number of devices in what are called the LifeX zip codes, which are primarily the zip codes on the east side where the life expectancy of residents can be up to 14 or 15 years lower or shorter than residents in the rest of the city. The city's equity requirements for scooters and bike share are less than a lot of peer cities. A lot of other cities are much more aggressive in their requirements for deploying those in underserved communities. It's something that we try really hard to exceed the requirements that the city provides. The other side of that is these programs work best where there is infrastructure like bike lanes and protected bike lanes and trails. And the unfortunate reality is the city has invested less on the east side in those types of infrastructure than in other parts of the city. And so it requires both investments in infrastructure, but also operations of those programs.
Okay, these are great questions. Next question, what work is going into closing the gap in data for desired trips? For example, the counting how many people swim across a river before building a bridge problem. A good question. Who wants to tackle?
Well, I certainly have some thoughts on it, but I bet you Eric does too. So Eric, if it's all right, I'll take a first stab at it. So I think this is a great question because it kind of speaks to the fact that, you know, a lot of our data is still kind of like lagging indicators, or yeah, like we sort of wait for the data to justify an investment before we'll do it. I mean, I can certainly say that there are some other ways to understand desire for travel. I've actually been impressed with some of the people in the Streetlight user community. Like, for example, looking at the lengths of automobile trips, and looking at like how many automobile trips are being made in a certain market or by a certain demographic that are, say, under 2 miles, and saying like there's actually demand there, at least potential demand for biking and walking, but for one reason or another, people are driving these really short trips. Or just even looking at like, and this like probably doesn't speak perfectly to the metaphor of getting across a river, because where there's a barrier, you probably won't see this, but like looking at just origin destination patterns that, like say for bikes, for example, and you might be able to identify, or like a deficiency in the system. There's a huge, origin destination pattern, like desire line, but nobody is biking on the roads in between. Well, what's going on? Do they, they feel unsafe? Is there some sort of a physical barrier? So, I mean, that I'd say that's some work going into it. There's all kinds of other work that more sort of on a policy level that I'd say would need to happen to successfully address that problem.
I totally agree with Jim. Something we did a few years ago when KCMO was working on a new bike master plan is we did a bike demand analysis as a planning product to show where people would bike if there were facilities available to get at that latent demand, which I think also gets to that question. We don't look at the Missouri River and say, geez, all these people are swimming across the river, we should build a bridge so they could drive across. We just build the bridge because we know that people need to cross. But yet when we're talking about walking and biking across something like the river, we do get that argument. And so we'll put a link here in the chat to that, to show that there is a lot of demand in the region beyond what we know about. And so it's a hard problem to solve, but a lot of folks are working on it for sure.
I think I've hit the questions. James would like to know, would it be possible to get the zone for the app expanded to cover Red Bridge? He'd really just like the zone to come straight to his house. For the app.
I assume that means for bike share, and we will certainly look into it. We try to center the zone around where we're able to put hubs, but we do have more expansion coming in the next couple of years, and so we will certainly put that on the wish list, James.
Okay, I think we got through the questions dropped in the chat box. So, and we're getting close to time. So you guys did a great job on keeping it to an hour. I would be curious just if folks want to drop in the chat, like, did you find this valuable? And is this kind of a look into data and analysis something that you would want in future programs, just to kind of keep our fingers on the pulse of what's going on? Because I don't want this to be a trend that goes away. I would like the bike boom to become the new normal. So I don't know. Tell us what you think, and then I'll let Eric close us out.
Thanks, Amy, and thank you to Jim and all of your colleagues at Streetlight who provided such valuable data. So if you didn't get your question answered or you think of one afterwards, please feel free to email us. We will send out a follow-up email tomorrow with all of the links that we've mentioned or shared tonight. And you can also reply to that email if you have other questions or feedback. So I want to again thank everybody who was here tonight. I also want to thank everybody who is a member or a supporter of BikeWalkKC. You are also data points. You can be counted by becoming a member and helping us do this work, provide more of these presentations, and really do more work to fight for you at City Hall to get more and safer places to walk and bike. So again, thank you, Jim. Thank you, Amy. Thank you, Lottie Horton, for also working behind the scenes on the Zoom. Again, look for that email tomorrow, and thank all of you. And I hope you all have a great evening and can get out for a walk or a bike ride this evening before the rain comes. Thanks again. Good night.